So we're now moving on to the next presentation, and again, if you click on that on your app, you'll be able to ask questions of our next speaker, who's going to talk about reimagining frontline housing, and it's Helen White, who's the Chief Executive of Taff Housing Association. Helen.
Oh, thank you very much. Gosh, what a tough act to follow. I thought that was excellent. Thank you. Really interesting. But I was actually quite pleased that there's quite a lot of similarity in perhaps some of the things that I'm going to talk about as well, because I do feel a little bit like a fish out of water here. This isn't a conference I've spoken at before. I'm used to speaking to housing people about housing, even though we talk a lot about partnership. So I think today actually being here is a really good example of how the TSA are reaching out to other sectors to really engage and get those conversations that will make a difference going. So, I'm going to put my timer on, otherwise I will never stop. Let's have a look. Okay. So my name is, as you've heard, my name is Helen White. I'm Chief Exec of Taff Housing Association based in Cardiff. I'm also a Tech Quality board member, and Tech Quality are focused on really driving up the value given to the accreditation and assurance around the quality of technology-enabled care, because I think that's really important, that people know that the services that they are using are safe and that they can have some assurance about how they are going to work. And I've been asked to talk today about reimagining frontline housing services by using technology. And having thought about that subject area, I did kind of think, well, to be honest, I'm sure there's people in this room that know an awful lot more about technology than me. And so what I'm going to do is talk a little bit more about some of my thoughts on the leadership requirements if we are going to make this step change to drive the difference that we need. So I'm afraid I don't have the answers. I don't know about yourselves, but I've been coming to conferences for a long time. For the first kind of 10 years, you think, oh, I'll get the answer today. And then all of a sudden you realise, you know what? There are no silver bullets. It's about constantly working together to try and collaborate and find new and better ways of doing things. But I think for me, I am really committed to driving innovation, focused around improving better outcomes for people, for communities, and I think there's real opportunity for us to work together to do that. So I'm going to use a little bit of an artistic license about how I've approached the topic, because I think the ability, as I said, is in this room. I think I decided this morning what we really need to focus on is cloning Mike from the care company, because I think if we could have mics everywhere delivering our care services, then we would absolutely crack the problem that we've got. The first thing that struck me when I started to research what I would say today was, how do I just push that? There we go, this one. So I think the first thing that struck me today was starting to think about what I was going to talk about was just some of the challenges that we have and how much there is to do to unpick some of the complexity around the systems that we have in place. This talks about, this slide here I sort of pinched from someone else's presentation, but it shows all the different interfaces when a patient is being discharged from hospital. So you can see there that they have to talk to housing, to pharmacy, to the doctors, to the consultants, to the nurses, to the OTs. And that results in, gosh, I couldn't even count them up, but an awful lot of different interfaces that mean there's delay and real challenge in getting people discharged from hospital in a timely manner. Now, technology's got to be able to help us drive that forward. I think we need to be quite brave in how we approach this. It's not about the technology. Many people have said today the technology exists. It's about the leadership to implement that technology. It's the how we go about making the changes and redesigning the services and the systems so that they really focus on helping people flourish, not just kind of doing more of the same, but putting a slightly different spin on things. So I think we need to really think about who and what is getting in the way. Now, this slide here, I Googled social care, and these were two of the pictures that came up, and I thought, gosh, what lovely, happy-looking situations these are. And I've been a bit cheeky in that I've kind of added in what I think the two ladies might be saying. And because I think the reality is, we all know that 15 minutes to go and have a connection with somebody, to make a difference, to help them flourish, is a nonsense. And I think what we need to do is get really brave about speaking truth to power. And I would love, I can say this because they're not here, but I'd love to put Matt Hancock and perhaps Simon Stevens in that dementia bus for a month and see how they get on and see how that perhaps changes their view on some of the services that they think we can kind of make work with a little bit of extra this, a little bit of extra that. I think that they are 1,000 miles away from the delivering a good service in 15 minutes. So the pressure that puts on people working in social care is just huge. I mean, the lady this morning talked about, Madeline talked about the care home report. And, again, it's really, really uncomfortable. But to think that the disgraceful situation that happened in the care home identified by Panorama earlier this year isn't happening somewhere else today is sticking our head in the sand. And I think we've got to face up to some of those really uncomfortable truths and keep shining light in those really dark places and drive forward the changes that we need so that people are not put in those terrible situations. But of course, we're kind of paralysed by the ongoing farce of Brexit, and that's presenting difficult challenges in terms of getting the political impetus to drive some of these changes that we need. So, of course, we all know that the reality of social care is somewhat more like this. People who work in social care, in healthcare even, are using food banks. That's, again, absolutely scandalous that a profession that should be a real vocation, that should be values-based, pays pretty much minimum wage or living wage, and people are driven to despair in how they are having to do their jobs. You could hear it in the emotion of Mike's voice this morning about how important those people were to him. And, if you were trying to do that in 15-minute slots or being pressured to do that in a way that didn't enable you to do the best by some of the people you're working with, then can you imagine the impact that would have on your own mental health and also your family? So we've got to get the right leaders. And I think leadership's an interesting one for me because I was at, we talk a lot about dispersed leadership, about co-production. I was at an event last week with some of the leaders from across Wales. And it was a brilliant event, really, really interesting event. But one of my comments was that there was a dress code. So I thought, well, why have we got a dress code? My dress code in work is dress for your day. Don't just wear suitable clothing. So I asked the organisers, well, why is there a dress code? And they said, oh, well, if we don't have a dress code, we have 1,000 emails asking what's the dress code. And I thought, well, what does that say about our leaders if they haven't even got the confidence to just wear what they want to wear, to be themselves, to be authentic? So I think there's a lot for us to do to really hold our leaders to account and say, let's just get real about what the real challenges is. It's not about what you wear, it's about what you do. Now, I absolutely love the NHS. This is a picture of me. 4 years ago, I found myself in A&E with meningitis. You'll be pleased to hear I did manage to take a selfie whilst in A&E with meningitis because I thought, well, if you're going to get a serious illness, you just want to tweet about it. But actually being faced with your own mortality is a really scary prospect when you're the mother of 2 young children. And it was a pretty terrifying 10 days. But what did surprise me, or maybe it didn't surprise me, but when I was getting better and towards the end of my 10-day stay in hospital, I was on a ward with 6 other ladies, and 4 of them had no medical need to be on that ward. It's just that their housing was unsuitable for them to go home. So they weren't ill, but they were in a hospital bed where they didn't want to be, being given the care at the cost of a hospital bed, when actually they had a home. If we put the investment into looking at how we could make their home more suitable, surely they could, and that would help in terms of detox figures, bed blocking, whatever the term is these days. And everybody would agree that makes sense, yet we still haven't quite managed to crack that issue. And that's one ward on one hospital on one day. So if you were to kind of ramp that up in terms of what that means across the country and the amount of money that we're wasting, it's absolutely scandalous. Now, I've put these 3 pictures up. I don't know if you can guess what they represent. I've used them in slides before in the housing sector. Now, for me, the Maverick and Goose that's the acute care. They're the cool dudes of the health sector, aren't they? They're the ones that do the kind of heroic, amazing, and it is amazing work. They are, held up on quite a lot of the TV programs that we see, being inspirational, amazing doctors and nurses who are helping really, really sick people. And of course, that's massively, massively important. Then you've got Mr. Bean, and I'd sort of see Mr. Bean as kind of your secondary care, sort of, not quite so glamorous, but doing a lot of hard work and really pushing and trying their best, but almost seeing a bit of the geeky side of things. And then, of course, you've got Cinderella, which I would say is the kind of social care service and really isn't valued. And it comes back to what previous speaker was saying about addressing the balance between the different parts of the health sector and how we need to value each other a bit more and see that integration much more holistically than we do now. And I think until we get funding, how funding is poured into the system through clinical commissioning changed to engage much more broadly with the voluntary sector, the housing sector, then we're not going to be able to make the brave and fundamental shift into a new world. Now, of course, the NHS was set up to deal with infectious diseases, and of course it is absolutely amazing. It wasn't set up to deal with chronic conditions, which is what it spends a lot of its time, probably most of its time, dealing with today. And I'm afraid to say that I feel we've moved from a national health service to a national illness service. And we really have got to grasp how we do care. And that's not to say there's some amazing things that go on. And I am using some of my ignorance around the sector, because I'm a housing person, to say some stuff that might sound a little bit controversial, but it's just a kind of an outsider's perspective on some of the challenges that I see. And I think, the care question is really hard. I was talking to somebody the other day, and they were saying that Beveridge, when he designed the welfare state, even he couldn't really grapple the issue of care, and he said, oh, well, care, I think that's woman's work. And of course, back in the when these services were designed, women probably weren't working, they were at home. So there was a different sense of how you were able to engage with your community, your family, your services, to provide that more horizontal network. And I think, again, this slide is pinched from a lady called Hilary Cottam, Professor Hilary Cottam. I'd recommend her book, Radical Help, about how we need to move back to some of those horizontal structures, horizontal networks, if we really are going to integrate the way we think about care, health and well-being, to be more focused around the wider community and not the kind of hierarchical approach. And I think we all know, from probably sitting in this room, that most of our ability to succeed in life comes from our networks, not from our knowledge. Nowadays, your CV is a pretty outdated way of getting a job. It's about LinkedIn, it's about who you know. And we need to understand how technology can support and enable horizontal networks to drive a different way of doing things. So we need to think differently. I think we need to restore a lot more human kindness to what we do. I think we need to find the compassion, and I know that's there, and I know that people, it feels like I'm talking to the converted. You're in this room, you have we care about people, but it can be often, I can imagine it can be pretty frustrating when you feel that the systems are not always kind, and we do dehumanize people. I love stories to illustrate some of these points. I was talking to a lady who'd been very involved with the Troubled Families project, and they went to visit. They went to visit a lady who was in quite a chaotic situation, and she was at risk of eviction because every time the housing officer turned up at the door, they went in. There was a load of white goods in the front garden, and the internal doors had been taken off the hinges. So housing would go down, refix the doors, at quite significant cost. They'd go down again and the doors would be off the hinges. Now, the housing department apparently were about to evict this lady for antisocial behaviour when the Troubled Families unit were able to engage with that family more holistically and find out that the reason the doors were coming off the hinges was that the kids were unscrewing them because they knew that that's what gave their mum the best chance of surviving the pretty ferocious beating that was probably coming her way from her partner after a night on the booze. That lady was then able to get the right help, the right support, and that family is now flourishing and that lady's back in work. So again, if we don't think about the kindness, how we treat people holistically, all those different services connecting together, we are not going to get the right outcomes. And I think, we need to change the narrative. This sort of language around fixing problems, managing need, focus on transactions. It's all, there's that feeling of pressure around getting to the lowest common denominator, when actually if we flip that around and think differently, perhaps reframe that narrative. And one of the things that this reminds me of, I went to a Women in Leadership event once, because I thought that would be quite an interesting thing to do. And it was good, I enjoyed it, but the lady said, well, what you need to do, if you're going to be doing public speaking, before you go on stage, go into the toilets, pretend you're putting your man outfit on and go, rah, and be all manly and blokish about how you do in your presentation. So that kind of fitted with the Sheryl Sandberg lean in, that to try and create change, that you emulate a certain style. But actually, I think we need to create our own style, a new style of leadership based on compassion and kindness, and certainly not fitting in to the system that we've got. So a couple more slides from me. I think, we have got to face up to that things are very, very different, and it often feels like we're trying to impose new technology, new ideas into systems which just are a million miles away from the reality of how people live their lives. The tweet there was somebody, I don't know if it's true, it might be totally false, but it surprised me that it wouldn't surprise me if it was true that actually, we live in a different culture nowadays where people idolize very different status symbols. The picture on there with the kids there, I work away Monday to Friday, so when I get home on a weekend, I fully expect my kids to be, wanting me to engage with them and talk to them. That's like 5 minutes after I get home, they're back on their iPads, as if I've never been away. So, I've kind of just got to go with that. My little drawing of a squiggle, again, I saw this somewhere and it really struck me that the straight line with a little dip shows the kind of 1950s welfare state where someone leave school, they get a job, they study, they fall ill. So then they're going to kind of dip, but the welfare state helps them back up to where they need to be, and then they're back steady. Nowadays, things are totally different. We don't live those lives where we graduate or leave school, get a job that we then stick in for the next 20-odd years, have perhaps the odd health crisis, maybe get married, maybe, we are up and down. We're in work, out of work, we've got gig economy, we've got a different way of how our lives work. So it's much harder to manage. So again, surely technology can really help us embrace some of that difference as opposed to trying to fit technology on systems that no longer are real. I was really interested this morning to when I put the telly on, it must have been a different channel to Madeline, but I was watching GMB and Jackie Stewart came on, and he was talking about his wife's dementia and how he is really focused on using the motorsport industry to drive innovation, because in motorsport, when they would identify a challenge, there would be a huge focus around the engineering, the investment, the focus required to sort that problem out really fast. So he's going to be using some of those same principles in the dementia care industry. So I think that was really interesting. I'll be following that to see where that goes. So I think we do need to be a bit more radical in some of the solutions that we come up with. So a couple final thoughts from me. We can't keep doing the same thing, throwing more money at the same way of doing things. That is the definition of insanity. I'm sure you will have seen that slide before. And of course, we need to enable those that work in housing, in technology, in health, well-being, social care. We need to enable them, give them the space to innovate, to think differently, to do things differently, to be disruptive. All those things that we've talked about earlier and throughout the day. And of course, the challenge with that is the reality is that for every problem, there's probably 1,000 different answers. And we all operate within this kind of world of KPIs and performance. And if we are going to do things differently, chances are they're going to get worse before they get better. So how many of you have leadership or are a leader that would allow your organisation's KPIs to take a dip on the journey to providing a better service? Again, this is the type of challenge that we need to bring to the forefront. Really quickly on this, I'm blessed to work in Wales. I don't just say my first language is Welsh. Wales is an amazing country to work in, and I really do think that we've got some great leaders who are really committed to changing the way that public services integrate. Now, there's a long way to go. It's not perfect by any means, but there is a real appetite at a very senior political level to drive a very different and innovative way to working together. We've got the world-leading Future Generations Act, which focuses a lot more on well-being. I think that's brilliant that we are thinking about what really makes a difference to people's lives. We talk a lot about GDP going up. The industrial strategies will focus on GDP. Many people will have heard me say, well, that doesn't impress me that much. GDP might be going up, but so is child poverty, so is male suicide, so is food bank use, so is childhood obesity. so is life expectancy is going down. So some pretty depressing stuff going on in the context of a rising GDP. I know which ones I would rather measure success against. This slide, I was lucky enough to meet a lady, and again, it does link to housing. Lucky enough to meet a lady who talked about her experience of engaging with her GP surgery. She had a really serious eye condition that when it was treated, they finally decided that they needed to treat it with steroids. But unbeknown to the doctors and unbeknown to her, that brought on some steroid-induced psychosis, which made her, put her in a pretty bad state. So her, when she was working full time, but when this drove a need for her to be signed off work. So she would, her day would go something like this. Can you stop cleaning long enough to call the GP? Yes. Can you concentrate long enough to stay on the line when you're on hold, listening or waiting for your slot in that GP's call answering system? Can you manage to leave the house? If you do manage to get an appointment, can you leave the house? And can you explain what's wrong without trying to fight the receptionist at the GP's surgery? And of course, if the answer to that was no, then there's no sick note, no job, and you're banned from the surgery. And that could lead to a situation where you have no income, impacting your housing situation. So I'm pretty sure technology, and I know it exists, we have the NHS app now, so enabling people to engage with the services in a different way can have a huge difference across all the different parts of their life. So we need to create the space for innovation. We've got to embrace failure and even celebrate it. As I said before, for every complex problem, there's probably 1,000 wrong answers. I am going to an event this year at Christmas, which is going to celebrate failure. It's going to be called Mistletoe and Mishaps. I wanted to call it Cocktails and Cock-Ups, but they wouldn't go for that, so we went for the other one. So we've got to get better at failure. We've got to accept that things go wrong, and when they do go wrong, we learn from it. We've got to get ready to play Kaplunk. We can't expect that we tinker in one area and that the marbles all stay in the other area. If you pull one of the straws out, chances are the whole thing will come crashing down. So we've got to be a bit more thoughtful in how we build in that complexity into our solutions. We've got to acknowledge the system, but don't always accept the system, and we need to challenge it. We shouldn't stop collecting inconvenient data. We've all seen things play out in America in the kind of post-truth era of Trump and popular radicalism, which basically if the data doesn't fit the narrative, they just ignore the data and go with the narrative. We've got to be really careful that we don't do that. And we've got to have a plan, but we have got to be willing to flex it. Things are changing all the time, and relationships are absolutely key. I asked a chap who I was speaking to last week when he was talking about leadership, what's the key to enabling space for innovation? And he said, well, you need to be more pirate. And that is, if you're unable to innovate within your situation openly, then apparently there's lots of covert innovation going on where people kind of get on with it in the background, come up with these solutions, go to Pirate Island or Pirate Cove, I think he called it, innovate, bring your solutions back and present them in a different way. Now, what a shame that we're having to do that and that we're not able to be more upfront about what we're doing. So my final thought is about the, the fact that there's only about half an hour or so between now and having your drinks and then the dinner tonight. I want to sort of say a little bit about the awards. I'm really excited to hear all the great stuff that's been happening. Those who know me that will know that I have a bit of a different view on awards. I think that it's brilliant. I also think, as I said before, we need to celebrate our failures because I think that's often where lots of the learning comes from. I've been fortunate in my career to be able to phone my mum and say, I've won an award. Isn't that brilliant? I'm dead proud and the family are proud. I've also had to phone my mum and say, I think I might get sacked. Don't watch the news. So that was, less comfortable, but I've got to admit I learned more from that experience than winning the award. But what I will say, if you do win tonight, and I am really looking forward to hearing the great stories, if you win an award, I think it's absolutely imperative that we share that good practice, because I guarantee if you tell 100 people about the award that you've won, the idea that you've had, 50 will probably think it's not a very good idea, so you've got half left. From that 50, you'll say, they may say, well, you know, we've got reasons why we can't do that, it's going to be difficult. So you've got 25 left. From that 25, half of them might get distracted, lose interest, go on to something else, so you've got 12. 6 of them will try it, but they might not get it right, so you're down to 3. So, you know, once you kind of go through that cycle, the chances of your really, really good idea sticking elsewhere diminish. So we've got to change that. We've got to roll out good practice, keep championing it, push harder. If it's worked for you, then surely it can work for others. So I think that's all I was going to say. As I said, I did take a bit of artistic license, not necessarily talking just about housing, but hopefully giving you some of my thoughts on the leadership, the collaboration, and also the bravery that we need if we are really going to bring back some humanity to how we approach this subject. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Helen. And I'm just going to ask one of the questions that we've had from the audience. And it's really a question about the right leadership approach to tackling something which I think is a common concern about many of our systems in terms of commissioning and so on, which is that very often we encourage perverse incentives in terms of how we spend our money, not necessarily getting the best outcomes, but getting the outcomes the system is saying it wants. So what sort of leadership might help us address that sort of perverse incentives question? I
think for me, leadership that is really clear that you can, that sometimes we focus on, we hit the target, but we miss the point. And that's a real shame that we are focusing on the wrong things. And I think we as practitioners have got a real duty to kind of hold or speak truth to power around some of that and say, well, actually, are we measuring the right things? Is that what we need to be doing? So some bravery. Another thing I sometimes do with some of the teams I work with, we often find ourselves in a meeting where we'll come up with ideas and somebody will say, yeah, but no, but no, we can't do that because... So I think if you reframe the narrative and after if you do want to challenge a suggestion, you have to kind of come up with a yes and answer as opposed to a no but. And that really changes things. So enabling that collaboration. But I think mostly as leaders, making sure you've got the back of your people who are working as part of that business, that if they fail, we learn from it and we get on, try something else.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Show your appreciation.